Hi, welcome to the archives. So this episode, I am. Um, it's a part two of the one I did the last one. So I did the first one, and this is part two. We're looking at Octavia Butler, the morning, the evening, and the night, specifically Lynn and Beatrice's relationship, and how Shane is getting in between the two of them. So this one is called. What is this one called? This one is called Drifting Away from One Another. So if you haven't checked out the other blog, do check it out. Basically, it gets into a story about two of Octavia Butler's characters. They meet each other for the first time and they're unable to get along. Backstory to that is they both have the same health condition. They are both double DGDs, which we can liken that to like mental illness, such as like schizophrenia, where they have psychosis. It leads them to drift, and now we're trying to make sense of what's happening now that they met. So we can parallel Lynn and Beatrice's interaction with feminists, or just encounters, period, that rub us the wrong way. When you meet somebody for the first time and you have no reason to not like them, but for whatever it is, the two of you are not clicking and not vibing. Their first impressions are anything but pleasant, right? So on the surface, at the physical, the material, and the objective level, there seems to be no apparent reason for tension, at least not immediately, right? So countless scholars and activists have thematized some of the relational dynamics that's happening between the two, that are tied to subject formation, social structures, and socialization. That's also linked to like the socio, the political, and even the cultural processes that are happening for the two of them, right? So Lynn addresses this and she says, not everyone was affected equally. They didn't all commit suicide, but they all mutilated themselves to some degree if they could. And so she's speaking about DGDs and how all of them at some level self-mutilate. To the extreme, they also mutilate others. And so in the story, I'm not going to get too much into it, but her father basically, spoiler alert, there's domestic violence, and Lynn's father, who is also a DGD, ends up killing her mother in a violent psychosis episode, and then he kills himself. If I'm not mistaken, maybe I'm making that up, but I think something was happening between the two of them. And so what she says is, in this regard, there's a lot of tangible things that are happening that we can name for sure, right? There's what's happening here. There's unequal power imbalance. Beatrice is a doctor. Lynn is a patient. Lynn is a college student. She's a young woman. Beatrice is 60 years old. So there are generational gaps, right? There's a little bit of ageism. She doesn't really think like they both are looking at each other like she's some small girl. She's looking at her like she's some old hag that doesn't get it. There's ethnicity, there's some colorism happening there. Lynn is a darker skinned woman, Beatrice is a lighter skinned woman. There's obviously unequal flows of power, there's some privileges that's happening. Class differences, one is employed, one's not. There's some ableism happening, there's some stainism that's happening. There's a lot of things that you can say, these are tangible reasons why they won't be getting along, right? We can name that this is, of course, they're not going to get along. Like this age difference might be the reason why they're not vibing. There's other things too. There's Dr. Laurie Santos has this thing called the G.I. Joe fallacy, which is a neurological lag that's associated with not doing better when you know better, right? So there's a lot of different things. There's also things that are happening and unfolding that cannot be clearly, is not as clearly articulated. You can't articulate it as clearly, right? There's no real, you can't put your finger on exactly what it is that's happening. And so that's the direction that Octavia Butler goes in. She's more interested in the things that are not tangible, the things that you can't necessarily see. And so in Dr. Beatrice's office, she explains to Lynn and Alan some of the variables that are at stake in bearing double DGD children. So you have to remember, Alan has DGD, so does Lynn, but Lynn is a double DGD, and so is Dr. Beatrice, who's also a double DGD. So the two of them want to have kids, and the doctor is going into some of the risks. And so she explains to them that she's actually not able to get along with Lynn because of the double DGD thing, right? So the condition that they have does not allow them to get along with each other. It's a pheromone. It's a scent, and it's sex-linked, is what Dr. Beatrice says. So she explains, men who inherit the disease from their father have no trace of the scent. They also tend to have an easier time with the disease. Men who inherit from their mothers have as much of the scent as men get. The same for women who inherit from their mothers, but not their fathers, she continues. If only it's when two irresponsible DGDs get together and produce girl children, like me and Lynn, that we get someone who really, we can really do some good in the place. So basically, double DGDs is when the double parents have a girl child, which is what happened to Lynn and Beatrice, right? And so she goes on to explain that the scent causes a disruption between the two. It doesn't happen between non-DGDs, it only happens with the double DGDs, which Lynn is a double DGD, Beatrice is a double DGD, right? So when they meet each other, when two women that have double DGD genetics meet, that is when this scent gets triggered and they're unable to get along, right? Something just goes awry and they're unable to, it repels them and they're repulsed by each other, I love that Octavia Butler really does that. And there's different ways that you can play around with it. For me, I'm really interested in the negative interaction between them as emotions, right? So for instance, shame or fear, two of the more difficult emotions that we navigate. And so I'm looking at it in a similar way as Octavia Butler does, as a scent or a pheromone that's emitted by and between the two, that circulates in the environment, and then it results in a perceived sense of threat of and by the other, right? And then this influences a change in their behavior. And so that then leaves the two of them separated from one another, unable to get along, then they're divided. This invisible variable is actually really important to how we live feminist lives. It shapes who we show up for in solidarity, and it impacts who shows up for us, right? And vice versa. So how much shame we are in is in direct correlation with our levels of engagement, right? So shame limits our mobility, it hinders our capacity, it'll slow us down, it'll burn bridges, it'll build up walls, and especially when we don't pay attention to how much is accumulating. So Dr. Sarah Ahmed says, emotions shape what we do, how we do things, and what we do things with, and where we go. So emotions affect how bodies take shape in social space and how spaces cohere around bodies. That's a lot of academic jargon, but basically she's saying emotions shape a lot of our lives, right? A lot of people think like, I'm not emotional, you're the sensitive one, but none of us can escape emotions. They shape who and what we are and what we do. They shape where we go, especially shame. If we're looking at shame or fear and mental illness, right? You might have agoraphobia, anxiety, you might be in the house more, you might be isolated from friends, you might be irritable. There's a whole bunch of different reasons why emotions shape what it is that we do and who we're able to get along with. So I'm really interested in shaping shames as lines and giving us a better example of the ways in which we're able to show up for solidarity and the ways in which we're not, and then also why and where. So shame obviously gets in the way of inter and interpersonal relationships, making solidarity messy and difficult to navigate, right? At our most affected, or at least for me, at my most affected, we risk being moved into problematic territory that runs contrary to feminism. So shame can often lead to a lot of maladaptive behaviors, right? Pettiness, aggression, rage, projection, deflection, blame. There's so many maladaptive things that we will engage in when shame is present. Performance, hiding. We talked about it. Control dynamics, right? I talked about Harry, how Harry weaponizes Lauren's journal and says, like, I need to read what you're writing in your journal. And he uses that, her shame, to basically manipulate her into reading more of her journal articles when that's not what she wants to do. So shame can be really problematic in that way, and it can lead us into a lot of maladaptive behaviors. Maladaptive being we're choosing mechanisms that are not necessarily for the best for ourselves or for others, right? Adaptive is we are adapting. We're moving in a more positive, quote unquote, healthy direction. And so I'm interested here in what's happening, what is happening. Like when they meet, the two of them have never met each other. Remember, they've never met each other. This is the first time that they're meeting each other. And all of a sudden they know that like there's just, they're incompatible. There's this fear, there's this dislike, there's this mistrust. Both Sarah Ahmed and Dr. Sarah Ahmed and Dr. Brian Masumi address this in the analogy of a child who encounters a bear for the first time, and she knows that instantly to fear the bear. She's never encountered a bear before. Nobody's ever told her that bears are dangerous. But when this child sees the bear, she takes off. And people will be like, well, obviously, like that's common sense. It's bigger than she is, and so on and so forth. Basically, what the two say is that there's a lot of scientific and neurological ways of explaining this, and psychological ways of explaining this. So, psychologists William James and Carl Lang of the James Lang theory, basically they say that first a child perceives the event or the external stimuli, which would be the bear, and then it receives feedback from their body reacting to seeing the bear. So, for example, she might tremble or she starts to cry, and then she's moved to feel the emotion, right, of fear, for instance. So cute. And then we have Walter Cannon and Philip Bard, who objected to this theory. They're like, nope, this is not it. You did not get it right. And according to the Cannon-Bard theory, seeing the bear is what provokes the fear as the emotional stimulus, but one that arouses the brain, specifically the thalamus, and then that sends a signal and a message to the cerebral cortex and the autonomic nervous system that a threat is being perceived, right? So this then sends a message to the cortex, which then produces the experience of emotion, of fear. There are others who espouse, from different, if you're from like an indigenous or an Eastern medicine or Eastern cosmology, African cosmology, New Age spirituality, they might locate what's happening as like intuition, as an intuitive knowing feeling, right? Or even fear that's separating the two of them. And so for Octavia Butler, it's the invisible scent. It's a pheromone. It's something that's getting in between the two of them, and they're unable to get along. There's obviously different ways of articulating it, and it leaves, at least for me, it leaves more questions than answers. And there's further research that's required on my part to make sense of this from like a more of a scientific, I guess more of like a sophisticated way of looking at this. STEM is not my area of research, but I'm really interested in like the chemistry behind this, the physics behind this, the mathematics, the neurology, the philosophy. Like there's so many different ways we can take an inter and multidisciplinary approach to what's getting in between Lynn and Beatrice. I am more, like I said, I'm interested in what shame is doing, right? How are they perceiving themselves as shameful? Have they bought into the lie that they're shameful? Have they bought into the lie that they are violent? Is that informing some of the fear, right? Lynn, again, this is only the second person Lynn has ever met that's a double DGD. Why does she obviously get along with others but not Beatrice? Is there gender stuff going on? Is there some girl hate going on? Is there some internalized stuff going on? We can make so many different assumptions, essentially all of this is assumptions. Their hypothesis, right? we would have to do further research in order to say this is for sure what's going on. But I'm more interested in more of the psychic stuff, the emotional stuff, the invisible objects. I love the idea that Octavia Butler plays with it as an invisible scent, as a pheromone, because that then brings affect into the conversation. It's something they cannot control, right? It's something beyond their control. Lynn didn't even know that there was a scent. She didn't even know that she was emitting pheromones that repulsed other people. She didn't know that other DGD women were emitting these pheromones that was affecting her, right? So this also ties in with like mirror neurons, for instance. There's so many different ways we can go with this, and I put this in conversation with another author, and to look more at like what does it mean to have shame be this invisible object, then that relocates you into a different realm, right? Where then you can have access to like ancestral knowledge, the Akashic files, so many different ways. There's so many different ways of looking at it, but all to say is like pheromones, emotions become this invisible thing that either precede or proceed us, and it can get in the way of our relationships with other people that might not always be conscious, that might be subconscious, unconscious, or even non-conscious, right? Yeah, so these are some of the ways I'm thinking about it. Obviously, maybe I'll share this in the future because I have to revisit the chapter. But these are some of the ways I want us to consider when we meet people who are very much like us, right? When we see another DGD, when we see another neurodivergent, when you see somebody else who's on the spectrum, when you see another Black person, when you see another woman, another man, somebody who resembles you, is like you, and you're unable to get along with that individual. What's happening there? That's a question that I'm really interested in. What's happening there? What kind of social formations are at play? Right? How have we perceived this other person, or rather, how has our perceptions of ourselves informing our interaction with this individual? How are some of the challenges we've had informing the conversation with another person? I attended a session online virtually recently that was with Alok Menon, Sonia Renee Taylor, and Adrienne Marie Brown. And Alok was talking about trolls and haters who leave hateful comments, and he was basically saying, "You hate me because you hate yourself." And I think this is what I'm trying to get at in a different way. Is Lynn hates Beatrice because there's some internalized hate going on. Beatrice has some internalized hate going on. And so when the two of them meet, like she said, it becomes a prison. Like now I have to confront everything that I've been trying to repress. I have to confront everything that I hate in myself just because I met you. It could be very uncomfortable when you meet somebody who is exhibiting things that you don't want to see in yourself. When you come in contact with somebody who reminds you of pieces of yourself that you've buried, parts of your trauma that you buried, things that you would rather not have to look at, it can be very uncomfortable. There's another blog I was thinking of doing. I think it was called like SZA and the Sport of Healing or something. But I was seeing some of the reactions to SZA's new album, and a lot of people were like, "Oh my gosh, she's not healed. I'm so much more healed than she is, and I can't listen." And I was like, "Are you sure you're healed the way that you think that you're healed?" Because all it sounds to me is like she's just triggering the parts of you you really didn't want to look at. Because when you're able to look at something, when you feel something, another person bringing it up to you is not going to bother you that same way. It's not going to trigger you that same way, right? If you're more secure, if you're truly healed the way that you said you are, then we're secure in that. We're not easily, we're rooted, we're grounded, right? Somebody's not going to throw us off kilter because, oh, sis, I'm so sorry that you're still stuck in that place. I get it. I've been there. In solidarity, you're not meeting that person with harshness. And that's what Alok was also saying, right? When you're able to see like, oh, I see myself in you. I am you. I've been where you are. There is a level of compassion because you know how hard it was to heal that. But when you actually haven't healed it and you're trying to pretend that you've healed it and all that you've done is moved on, left it behind, avoided it because you got to move on. And that's okay. I'm not knocking that. I do that all the time. There's certain things. I was just having a conversation with somebody today about that. There's certain things that I can't go deep into because I got to keep it moving. If I go into it, I'm going to go into it. And so sometimes when that happens, when we haven't addressed something and somebody else shows up and they have addressed it or they haven't addressed it and they're vocal about it, that's very uncomfortable for us. It's very, very uncomfortable because now you're asking me to confront things that I don't want to confront. And I cannot harm with you. I cannot be friends with you. I cannot respect you. I cannot come close to you because coming close to you means it's coming close to that thing in myself that I'm trying to avoid. So now I gotta avoid you. I gotta make you a villain. I gotta make you wrong. I gotta make you bad. I gotta to then justify why we need to separate. And sometimes that could be the trauma. That pheromone could be trauma. That pheromone could be shame. That pheromone could be fear. And so that's where I'm going to leave it here because my battery is about to die. But think about that. I got to work on this chapter a little bit some more, but and there's a lot of other pieces, but that's what I want to get us to think about is thinking about Lynn and Beatrice as all of us. There's a Lynn and Beatrice in all of us, right? When you encounter another person who's exactly like you in so many ways, that makes you really uncomfortable, that you can then no longer accept that person in your life because for them to be in your life makes you so uncomfortable that you have to confront things that you don't want to confront. And so yeah, that's what I wanted to discuss in this blog. Until next time, it's all good. Okay. Bye from me and Kitty. Say bye, Kitty.